Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing well and that you are safe wherever you are, and that you're enjoying the readings that are part of your syllabus. Um, so this is the first time I'm recording any lecture, so I hope the voice is clear, and I hope everything um, when it reaches you, it is understandable. In case you, after the lecture, have any questions, you are most welcome to contact me on Canvas, or you can send me an email, whichever seems easiest to you. So let's get into it. Um, Now, I think it would be helpful to quickly go over the previous ages a little bit so that we know where we stand, because in person we have missed a lot of we have had a big break, so it might be a good idea for you to review. um, in order to understand what modernism is and what it means and what an impact, what were the causes, or what were the factors that resulted in the modernist movement, it is important to understand the previous movements that have come before it. So you remember the first movement, the place where we started the course from. We started it with the Enlightenment era. We started it with how the world was changing because of science. If somebody, let's say, if you have to explain Enlightenment to anyone, you can simply begin by explaining that the biggest change that took place at that time was science. The fact that we started to understand the world in a different way from what it we used to in a different way from how it was understood before. So um, science changed thought. People were considered rational human beings. The essential quality of human beings at that time was rationality, the ability to reason, which is why the Enlightenment is called the Age of Reason. And we have discussed in the class how Enlightenment impacted religion, impacted politics, and eventually led to the Romanticist movement, which naturally criticized and critiqued um, the complete focus on reason and rationality, and no emphasis of any kind on human nature, on sensitivity, on basic human values. So, but at the same time, it was the Enlightenment spirit which led to the revolutionary spirit of the Romanticist era, which led people to, um, you know, fight against tyranny, like in the French Revolution or in the American, um, when the American nation um, finally got rid of the Britishers. So, all of these revolutions are extremely important in themselves because there was this utopian idea in people's minds that these things would now mean a really good, really excellent change in human condition, and they were good things that happened, of course. But you now remember that we discussed realism in class as well, because people realized at that time that there was rationality, science, technology, progress. All of these things were not really um, removing poverty, were not really removing people's distress, because the lives of people had changed on a very big scale. So people had to move for work from their villages. Peasant life had changed. They moved to cities to work in industries. The new industrial revolution was taking place, which meant that suddenly they were in a very different environment, and in a very hostile environment at that. Now, modernism is an extension of that movement, because at that time, um, the European empires the colonial empires were the biggest empires. Now, let's take a minute and look at a few things. I hope you have your notes in front of you that I've uploaded so that we can go over them together. So, when we look at the term modernism, modernism in its broadest sense simply means, designates a time. Um, so, let's say when we use the term modern, we mean the time after Romanticism and after the realist movement, but that does not mean that this is a clear cut demarcation of time, because it's not. Um, a clear cut demarcation would be, well, the realist era has ended and the new modernist era has started. But actually, all of these eras are kind of overlapping in some ways. So, with you can look at modernism as an extension of it. But what were the things that make it uniquely modern? Um, Naturally, it was an artistic and a literary movement. But to understand why that movement took place, is it is essential to see the historical context, because if you look at the time from 1900s to 1945, it was a very, very turbulent time in human history. World War One, World War Two took place. It was the bloodiest time in human history, and the Holocaust took place. So people began to see that the modern technology and rationality of human beings that had been highlighted in the previous ages, and the solution to all human problems, was science, was not really working out, because science was not really creating a situation which was all good. Yes, there were technological advancements, there were great progresses made in the human health department, human life expectancy had increased, communication was amazing, the world was turning into a global village, um, and communication was fast. But at the same time, the science also gave us a lot of weapons. It gave us weapons of mass destruction, like the atomic bomb. Um, it made people, it made war easier um, and bloodier. So that led to a lot of isolation in the human condition. Now, if you look on your notes, and we can do that together, on the first page, with the third um, definition of what modernism is. Modernism became a condition, which is very essential to understand, because modernism was not just a literary movement, there were causes behind that literary movement. People, Darwin's theory had come out, which is a very essential thing in science, which kind of put human beings on the same footing as other animals. There was the distinguishing feature that God had created human beings as separate and better than other creatures was fundamentally questioned, and that shook the foundations of faith. And the church, which, Voltaire and others had thought would retreat on the onslaught of science, did not retreat. The battle continues. But at the same time, the battle between faith and science was such that people felt completely isolated. The Enlightenment thinkers had said that it would set human beings free, they would be able to use their own rationality. And yes, they were free in the modernist era. But free from what? They were free to be free from constraints of religion, constraints, rituals of religion, constraints of, a combined interdependent family structure. There was a lot of influence on materialism, influence on individual success, which led to people being alone, people being isolated, and that led to a lot of despair. Imagine yourself suddenly moving from a scene of nature um, to a city where you have never been before, and having to live in a very dark, a very bleak place, working in an industry with absolutely no securities and no social nets available for you, and being alone. And that led to people feeling despair. They felt that all the things that the Enlightenment and the Romantic movements had promised had failed. And because of that failure, modernist condition was born where people were alone, isolated. There was a crisis of faith. Um, there was loneliness. There were wars going on. Colonial powers were exploiting the colonized in very brutal ways. People, some people were fighting for their freedom, and their own nationalist governments commit and killed millions of people. So the situation was getting bleaker and bleaker. And in this situation, um, when there were world powers, three new kinds of government systems emerged. It is important to keep that in mind. On the one hand, the European capitalist system was emerging, which led to further isolation because capitalism naturally is the free market. But the free market at the cost of what? At the cost of human life, at the cost of being completely isolated. So many things were being born. On the other hand, there was socialism and communism, which were both practiced not in exactly almost the same ways. I mean, they were different systems, but the object remained the same of making a better economy. Now, let's move on to from this to the kind of literature that was being produced at this time. Um, Theorists such as let's look in your textbook as well because that'll help me remember. So, Karl Marx, the German Karl Marx, spoke up and wrote about the exploitation of the working classes, which led to the whole field of study, which is today or theory known as Marxism. He talked about how the working classes were being exploited and how capitalism was a very, very dangerous system and how it led to a lot of problems. Theorists like Friedrich Nietzsche attacked the idea that there was a conviction, that there was a God, that human beings were fundamentally rational because the war, the misery, everything had shown that human beings were not fundamentally rational, that there were problems with the whole Enlightenment premise. Um, at the same time, psychoanalysis was born. Sigmund Freud wrote his interpretation of dreams, and in that, he talked about how early sexuality, childhood sexuality, and you know, Oedipus conflict is basically led to human growth and human psyche development. So while these things were happening, Ferdinand de Saussure, another theorist, talked about how language worked, our language itself, how language conveyed meaning, how did it all emerge. So when this was coming out, authors, literary writers, um, novelists, poets, they used these theoretical ideas to construct a literature that fitted that time. And that literature today is called modernist literature. Now, when we think of modernism, and the first names that come to our mind are names like James Joyce, Ulysses, right? Virginia Woolf. Let's think of some others. Joyce, Ulysses, Ezra Pound. Um, all of these names show that at that time there was a lot of experimentation that was being done in literature. People were breaking away from established modes of writing. If you remember the Underground Man, what was he doing? He was looking inside for a search of truth, right? He was looking inside himself instead of looking at the world because he was disillusioned with the world. And the same thing, he became like a precursor of the modernist movement. And so, modernist characters would be characters who were anti heroes, characters who were depressed, who were in despair, who saw war happening all around, who wanted to do something, but at the same time, they were a mixture of essential good and essential bad, and they were dealing with a lot of things that were going on around at the time, and the biggest thing was despair. So a lot of these stories have been written in the backdrop of the World War taking place, and um, that kind of lends its character. So when we look at experimentation, if you look in your slides in front of you, let's take a minute and see what are the characteristics of the modernist literature. Okay, so the first characteristics of modernist literature are fragmentary techniques, leaving things open ended, a run ons, stream of consciousness. All of these things that were in the previous centuries in writing considered not writing at all. Because think about it, if someone in Voltaire's time or in Wordsworth's time had written a novel which was incomplete, a novel which did not explain the character, a novel which did not, um, you know, complete its story or let people to develop their own ideas, it would be considered incomplete writing. Here, however, the questioning of authority, because remember, modernism is not a singular movement. There were multiple avant-gardist movements taking place within modernism. So, like Dadaism and Surrealism, war also led to existentialism, which is, who are we? Does our life has any meaning at all? If you guys have read the play Waiting for Godot, that kind of sums up the whole atmosphere of the existentialist movement. Like, we keep on repeating the same acts, but where are we going from there? Is there a God coming to save us? Is there somebody going to come and save us in any way? Literature at that time expressed those problems. There were certain writers who thought that they should, like Marxists, they thought that they should use their platform as authors and poets to talk about the modern condition and criticize the older ideas. But there were others who just went inside, looked inside for some kind of hope. Because remember, without religion, with this isolation in this new world, one thing that it emerged was that people didn't know where to look for right and wrong, for morality in a very, very materialistic world. So they used fragmentary techniques, fragments of thought, ideas taken from maybe a painting, taken from. Let's look at the slides that might explain it better, because I'm very conscious of the time that I'm recording, and that kind of makes me lose focus a little bit. So, interpretations, connections, summaries, compared to earlier writing, modern literature looks, it basically omits, it lets you, it doesn't provide a background or a landscape and say, well, here is how the story takes place, this is a family, this is happening. No, it immediately starts, it's psychological, it talks about what goes on. Take Woolf's novels, if you have read them. Yes, there is a little bit of commentary, but they're all stream of consciousness, which means that they go back in mind. They discuss what Woolf was thinking about, not saying, thinking. And if you take a minute and you start writing down everything that you are thinking, what does a thought look like? A thought is very fragmentary. So these novels, like Joyce's novels, they mimic these techniques. And then there were shifts in perspective, and usually if there are multiple authors and there are shifts in perspective in Enlightenment or in the Romanticist or even the Realist era, people would alert the readers that the perspective has shifted, or there would be some ways in which that would be known. Here, there would be sudden, unexplained shifts in perspective, voice, tone, and because all of these things were supposed to mimic the situation of the world. We cannot understand the world. We have to try and make sense of a very difficult thing, and the literature mimicked that situation. So these changes, these fragments, this showed how the world had broken up, how the essentially unity that was present in Romantic literature, because it was present in our world, was no longer there. But in modernist authors at the same time, this fragmentation did not mean that they were celebrating this fragmentation. It meant that they were mourning the loss of this unity, mourning the loss of this, um, you know, um, this feeling of wholeness that had gone. So, this kind of nostalgia for the old world remains a part of the modernist writing. And then we have the very important, I'm really going to return back to it because stream of consciousness is one of the most central techniques that emerged during the day, during that time. So, because of the effect of Sigmund Freud, the idea that human mind might be something that might be able to give us some hint about human nature, about how human beings worked, how human beings progressed, became a major technique during this particular era. But at the same time, a new knowledge was emerging. People were beginning to see that our faculties, our rationality was very limited because we cannot be entirely rational. Our thoughts, our experiences, our opinions are all subjective. So people begin to question what is truth. Is everybody's truth different? So these were very, very new ideas at that time. Now, there were simultaneously within the broader modernist movement other movements in art and in literature taking place, like Cubism, Expressionism, Surrealism. Surrealism definitely was in literature as well. If you look on your slides, you will be able to see examples of those things. I think you might find it interesting, so I've added them. Hopefully, they will be able to give you a little bit of clarity about this. So we can, to sum it all up, say that modernism was a critique of the Enlightenment, or the critique in such a way that it showed, or it critiqued those dreams, utopian, idealist dreams of the Enlightenment and Romantic philosophy, and showed them how the world was broken. And it also showed human beings not as rational, but as basically flawed individuals who were also materialistic, who had serious flaws in many ways. Because how else do you explain what was happening in the world? Also, the Holocaust had a big impact on, you know, literature and on human psyche at that time, because it was one of the cruelest things that a human being who was educated could do to another group of people. And despite the fact that there was a crisis of faith, religion still played a major role in that. So, all of these things showed that science could not get rid of these ideals. I hope the idea of modernism is clear. I'm going to read out what is written on your in your notes, hopefully to sum up the changes. So the first thing is that the world was turning into a global village. Technology was advancing at an unprecedented rate, and communication was becoming very, very fast. There was a lot of industrialization, and naturally, there were problems associated with industrialization as well. And the weapon industry was expanding. There were new government systems emerging, nationalist governments were emerging, world wars and the Holocaust took place. And then there were anti-colonial and nationalist colonialist movements that started. Because of the world wars, the powers of the allies, powers of the colonial powers were reduced. They could not handle the empire anymore, which the nationalist movements and the freedom fighting movements took advantage of, and they started asking for freedom. And Britain and France and other countries had to, for their own benefit, give up those territories, and naturally at a lot of cost, which led us to the second, which will lead us to our next portion, which is colonial literature and post-colonial literature. So if you look at the literature, it shows disillusionment, loneliness, existential dread, existential crisis, um, problems of working classes, problems of the common man, a lot of immigration, a lot of movement, a lot of death, a lot of loss, a loss in a sense of community, in a sense, and in relationships. All of these things were emerging very, very rapidly. So please go over the notes. I hope they will be helpful for you. And now let's move on to the reading. Hopefully, that will be helpful for you. George Louis Borges. I hope you like the story. The story is, for me at least, I really love the story. And not only is it beautifully written, it is very, very, it is very typical of Borges' style. So, you know that Borges was an Argentinian author who, at in the manner of that time, studied in Europe. He spoke Spanish, English, other languages. He was his father and his mother were both interested in literature, and from that very early age, he was interested not just in literature writing, also in philosophy. So a lot of his works are a combination of different genres. So if you look at The Garden of Forgotten Paths, as the name suggests, the first thing that I would like to mention about it is the work is very global in nature. Think of the nationalities present within it: German, Chinese, Irish, British. These are the four nationalities that are definitely present within the novel. Think of the German, the boss that the hero of the story, or the anti-hero of the story, Dr. Yusun works for. All right. Then Dr. Yusun is a Chinese. His ancestor, and I'm very bad with names, so I will have to go over and look at it. Supan. His ancestor is Chinese. He is of a very, very distinguished Chinese family. On the other hand, the captain, who is Captain Richard Madden, who is after him, is an Irish. And all of this is in the backdrop of the First World War taking place. Now, you know that because of the World War, the world was together, people were being used as spies, but this is a very different kind of thing because so many nationalities were coming together. So the story, this very modern story, takes together all of these instances and puts them in front of you. It also deals with the idea that Borges was extremely conscious of, the idea of time. How do we perceive time? What is the scientific explanation for time? And then, is that the only explanation? Because science has proven to be wrong at so many things. So there were philosophical theorizing present within it. Now, also, as far as genres goes, the story is very unique. It begins as a historical narrative, moves on and becomes a detective story, which again, Borges was very, very, he really liked writing detective stories and stuff. In the middle of the World War, it's a spy story, and then moves on to literature, philosophical discussions, and then at the end returns on to the spy story, but with a twist. Because now at the ending, we have the idea of what the human condition was like. Because Dr. Yusun is not happy when he achieves his objective. So the whole story is, let's do summarize it quickly. Story is about a Chinese spy, Dr. Yusun, who is in England, and he is spying for the Germans. And his partner's cover gets blown. The person who is on the lookout for him is an Irishman working for the English, and you know the relationship between Irish and Britishers was not cordial. So the Irishman wanted to prove his loyalty, or prove that yes, he was working for the Britishers, and to do that, to show his loyalty, he was implacable. He wanted to definitely do his best. So he was a very, very ruthless opponent. On the other hand, Dr. Yusun was also ethnically motivated because he hates the Germans he's working for. He hates the fact that he's being forced to become a spy, but at the same time, he still wants to show that the word he uses, the Chinese, can actually save somebody's armies. So he wants to convey the location for the ammunition, which is in the city of Albert. And to do that, he knows he doesn't have a lot of time. He doesn't have the option of calling his German boss and informing him. So he takes up the yellow pages. He goes over the names of people and he finds the first person, um, sinologist. A sinologist is a person who studies Chinese language, Chinese culture in a lot of detail through the Chinese modes of knowledge. So he goes there and he discovers that this person has been going over the novel written by his own ancestor and has actually found the truth about that novel. They have a long, very fruitful discussion, and he says that this man is very important. He respects this man, he likes this man, and yet, for this ethnic pride, for this sense of proving himself, he kills that man because, again, the news of his murder with his name would go in the newspapers, and because of the name, the Germans would be alerted, and they would be able to take down the city. And he does it, but at the same time, he doesn't feel happy about it. So now this is the story. Let's take a look at a few things, how the story begins. If you look at the beginning, it can be a little confusing. On page 455 of your Northern Anthology, Volume F, I'm going to take a... Alright, so on page 22 of Little's Hart's History of World War I, you will read that an attack against the Seymour Barton line by 13 British divisions, supported by 1,400 artillery pieces, planned for the 24th of July 1916, had to be postponed until the morning of the 29th. The torrential rains, Captain Little Hart comments, caused this delay, an insignificant one, to be sure. Now it begins like a history book. So you see the meshing of the genres, the fragmentation that we talked about in the modernist literature, you see it there, because suddenly this fragment of history is interspersed with a completely different thing. The following statement, dictated, reread, and signed by Dr. Yu Soon, former professor of English at the Hochschule at the Sintao, throws an unsuspected light over the whole affair. So this continues, and then the next 2 pages are all about the account or the spy story. So you see, again, the fact that the first 2 pages are missing, there is another kind of fragmentation, right? So let's move on to the story. This is the place where Dr. Yusun hangs up the phone, realizes Richard Madden is after him, and he knows that his death is coming. He knows, and at the same time, his idea is that he needs to fulfill this one task that is left to him. Now, if you move on and look at yes, the end of this page, the same page, second last line. It seemed incredible to me that that day, without premonitions or symbols, should be the one of my inexorable death. In spite of my dead father, in spite of having been a child in a symmetrical garden of Haifeng, was I now going to die? So he's thinking back about his own family, about what his family meant to him. And he came from a very because remember, this is a fictitious world, fiction world. So he came from a family, a very renowned Chinese family. So he's reflecting on what he has become in this new world. Now, if you look at page 456, and you will notice a few things about that are similar to the Underground Man. All right. In the last paragraph on page 456, he begins by saying, "I'm a cowardly man. I say it now that I have carried to its end a plan whose perilous nature No one can deny. I know its execution was terrible. I didn't do it for Germany. No. I care nothing for a barbarous country which imposed upon me the abjection of being a spy. Besides, I know of a man from England, a modest man, who for me is no less great than Goethe. Um, Now, there are a few things that I would like you to note. For one thing, this is introspection again. Doing something against your own interests, like the underground man did. For example, he wouldn't go to a doctor because it wasn't his interest, but he still wouldn't do it. This person here, he respects the man he kills, and he does not at all respect the Germans, yet he's working for them. See this, leave two lines and move to the next one. He says, I did it because I sensed that the chief somehow feared people of my race. So another theme that emerges here is the idea of the racism, and the concept of how different races regarded other races. There was a lot of ethnocentrism, specifically at that time. Europeans regarded themselves as the best race. Um, and that came with its problems because other races either wanted to or were put in the position of wanting to prove themselves, or because there were ideas on both sides of the spectrum where people thought that they were better, or they had to prove themselves, or there were stereotypes associated with a certain race, and that had a reason behind it too, because Europeans gathered knowledge on different races, whether they were brown people or yellow people or any kind of words that they used for them. And that information kind of stereotyped those people in a very negative ways, and that had a psychological impact on them. So if you look at this story and you look at this character of Dr. Yusun, he's an educated man. He has taught at a university. And now here he is, because of whatever is happening in this world, in this position, right, where he's a spy and working against his own interests. For what? For a gain which is completely useless to himself as an individual, which shows of how what would be the word for it, which shows how devastated or how in despair or were many people at that time. Now, if you move on to the next page, there's this whole fatalism present in the story as well, that we have already, if you have to do something really bad, you have to take a decision and think that you've already done it so that nothing stops you. If you look at page 104 and 457, page number, the paragraph, the second paragraph that begins with, from the broken state, I passed into an almost abject felicity. In this paragraph, see the italicized lines. The author of an atrocious undertaking ought to imagine that he has already accomplished it, ought to impose upon himself a future as irrevocable as the past. So again, this is all him planning. And then, thus I proceeded, as my eyes of a man already dead registered the elapsing of the day, which was perhaps the last and the diffusion of the night. And think of this. This is a person who knows death is coming. He has accepted it. And at the last moment, he is doing something for somebody he does not respect. I don't know what your opinion about the story is, but it is very, very representative of the modernist era. And a lot of stories do this kind of thing. Also, this symbol or this motif of a maze or a labyrinth, which is present in this story, is a part of a lot of other stories written by George Louis Borges. It is a recurrent symbol, and here he uses it a lot for the concept of time, the concept of dimensions, how action is taking place, all of those things. Now, this paragraph, the next one, which begins with a lamp, think for yourself how it shows a maze. A lamp enlightened the platform, but the faces of the boys were in shadow. One questioned me, "Are you going to Dr. Stephen Albert's house?" Without waiting for my answer, another said, The house is a long way from here, but you won't get lost if you take this road to the left, and at every crossroads, turn again to your left. Think about how mazes are formed, and this particular maze like thing continues on. Um, and then he thinks about his ancestor. He thinks about his ancestor Supan, who had been a man of eminence, a man, a very important man in China. And this person had left everything to go and write a novel, and he in this secure solitude, in this lonely place where he spent 13 years, the garden of limpid solitude. And he said he was going to do two things. He was going to create a labyrinth, and he was going to write a novel. And then in this ancestor, Sui Pen was murdered by a complete stranger, and the novel was published, but the novel never made any sense to anybody. And the mystery of this novel is solved by this sinologist, um, Stephen Albert, because he talks about in this novel about how he has worked with this novel, studied it, and has understood it. Now, if you move on to the next page, he goes down the path, um, and he comes to Stephen Albert's house. And the funny thing is that what he sees there is a very, very a situation that kind of mimics his ancestors' place of refuge or solitude, the same maze-like sense, because he says there is a garden of working paths there. Now, if you look at the term, the garden of working paths, it itself kind of recalls the motif of the maze and the labyrinth. And also, for me, it also reminded me of Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken. If you remember, that also talks about the choices we have. We might take one choice, we might take another choice, and that completely changes our future. Here, in this particular story, the reader reading this is constantly unaware of what is going to happen, but at the same time, you can't help but think that the protagonist could have made better decisions, could have taken on a different kind of route, could have not done this kind of thing, and the outcome might have been different. Now, this man is a sinologist. He starts talking to him about his ancestor. Um, the spy also tells him that he is the descendant of Sui Pen, and they find out, and he tells him that what people mistake about Sui Pen is that they think that he was creating two different things, a labyrinth and a novel. But actually, the novel itself was the labyrinth, which is why people have not been able to um, understand it completely. Now, if we turn to page 459, where they are discussing this, I would like you to see a few lines which might be helpful. So, a labyrinth of symbols, he corrected, an invisible labyrinth of time. To me, a barbarous Englishman has been entrusted the revelation of this diaphanous mystery. After more than 100 years, the details are irretrievable, but it is not hard to conjecture what happened. Sweepen must have said once, "I'm withdrawing to write a book," and another time, "I'm withdrawing to construct a labyrinth." Everyone imagined two works. No one did it occur that the book was the maze. The book and the maze were the same thing. The pavilion of limpid solitude stood in the center of the garden. That was perhaps intricate. That circumstance could have suggested to the ears a physical labyrinth. Sweepen died. No one in the vast territories that were his came upon the labyrinth. The confusion of the novel suggested to me that it was the maze. So he explains why he thinks that, and he brings out a small note that Sweepen wrote, and the note says, "I'll leave to various futures, not to all, my garden of working paths." So this particular future, so he says that in normal human history, what happens is that we take a path and that determines our course of future. But in this novel, The Garden of Broken Paths, all the futures are happening simultaneously in different dimensions, and they will go on eternally, right? So if you turn to page 460, it says, almost instantly I understood The Garden of Broken Paths was the chaotic novel. The phrase various futures, not to all, suggested to me the focusings in time, not in space. A broad rereading of the work confirmed the theory. Now, when Stephen Albert tells him this, our protagonist is impacted. He thinks about it and he says this is true. And they talk about riddles, you know. Um, how do riddles function? Um, you know, the answer to the riddle is never present word for word in the riddle. So the riddle is time, and time is the same concept that Borges has concentrated on a lot. Our perception of time, scientific perception of time, philosophical perception of time, and all of these things are present in this detailed philosophical discussion in the middle of a historical and then a spy story. There is this whole discussion of history, of literature, of letters, of interpretation. So if you start looking at it, there are so many themes, and the themes are cyclical. And at the end, when Richard Madden comes back and our protagonist shoots Albert to send a message to the Germans, they have come a full circle, because think of it. Suipen, the ancestor, worked for 13 years to compose The Garden of Broken Paths, that novel, and then he was killed by a stranger, right? And in coincidence, which is another aspect of Borges' writing, Stephen Albert, who is a sinologist who works a lot to find the secret, um, is killed by a person who's a stranger to him, our protagonist, for absolutely no fault of his own. So the story has come kind of full circle, this whole cylindrical, coincidental thing that is happening. And at the same time, I'd like you to take a minute and look at the ending. On the next page, page 462, he says, I swear his death was instantaneous, a lightning stroke. The rest is unreal, insignificant, mad and broken. Arrested me. I have been condemned to the gallows. I have won out abominably. I have communicated to Berlin the secret name of the city they must attack. They bombed it yesterday. I read it in the same papers that offered to England the mystery of the learned sinologist Stephen Albert, who was murdered by a stranger. One Yusun. The chief had deciphered this mystery. He knew my problem was to indicate, through the uproar of the war, the city called Albert, and that I had found no other means to do so than to kill a man of that name. He does not know, no one can know, my innumerable contrition and weariness. So you see, in the end, what Yusun is left with is contrition, weariness, misery for his choices. So the story not only invokes moral issues, ethnic issues, ideas of race, concepts of philosophy, but it juxtaposes all of them together. And the novel itself, um, in the novel within the story, The Garden of Broken Paths, it represents the universe, the world in which we live in. In the same way, the small short story that Borges wrote also mimics the chaos, the um, labyrinthine ways in which our world, or the world of his time, I would say, the modernist world worked, how people behaved, what were the motivations behind that behavior. So he kind of mimics all of that in such a short story. I personally love this story, and I hope you enjoyed the story as well. I would like to hear your opinion about it. Let me know what you think about it, and I hope this lecture will be helpful to you. And I will be uploading the next portion for colonial literature and post-war literature soon, by Sunday. Hopefully, that will be helpful for you too. Great. Um, well, I'll end the lecture now.